quick questions of clarification.
Yeah. Elliot Douglas, National Science Foundation. I'm just curious, what basis is your authority for taking disciplinary actions? And what happens? Yeah.
Yeah. Our membership bylaws say that any member must agree to comply with the Code of Ethics, and that there's a disciplinary action if they fail. Having said that, the most we can do is kick somebody out of the society. So we get the cases. I'm always pleasantly surprised when somebody cares enough to actually fight for their membership. A lot of times when somebody's going to jail, chances are they're not even going to respond to us. They're just going to drop their membership. But at the same time, the complaints are meaningful, and we are pleasantly surprised when we have a lot of people say they take their membership seriously, and so they take complaints very seriously, even though at the end of the day, being the worst case scenario is that you can't give us $225 a year now for the rest of your life. So. But it is still, again, it still does get a fair amount of attention.
Okay, good. So I'd like to kick this off by asking a question to all the panel members and encourage the rest of you to formulate questions. And the question that I'd like to ask, and would just invite any of you to speak to this, is that when I look at medical ethics, which I think has been quite successful at infusing ethics into the professional curriculum, one of the things that strikes me is that a large part of that subject matter does not focus on the individual conduct of the physician. Certainly that's part of medical ethics, but they don't understand medical ethics primarily as developing a capacity in the individual. They really see the subject matter as the way in which the changes in medical practice, and especially in terms of medical technology, challenge some of the established norms of the profession. And I'm wondering if the panel members could speak to the way in which they see analogies or differences in the engineering profession.
I'll jump into that first. It's a great question. I think with the training of physicians, first and foremost, they have a much longer time horizon for the kind of education they're getting. So there's more opportunity in the education of physicians from medical school to their residencies to have these kinds of conversations, where in engineering we feel a little bit constrained, especially with undergraduates, to get that time all in. It is interesting that they focus in on the broader concerns about the professional jurisdiction of medicine rather than necessarily the engagement with clients one-on-one. And I think in engineering, it's really interesting because engineers are engaged in producing technologies that are going to be impacting a wide variety of people's lives. And so in that case, rather than in a one-to-one engagement with individual patients, we're talking about things that can affect thousands, if not millions of people. And so the difference between the emphasis in medical education on engineering, or on ethics versus in engineering, is actually quite glaring, I think, in that perspective.
Anyone else?
I will say that one of the things that we always struggle with are engineers say that they're not in a position to make the decision anyway. When you're the medical professional directly interacting, there's not somebody. I'm sure there are circumstances where somebody over your head telling you that you shouldn't be considering those things, but we struggle with giving guidance to people all the time on what to do when, okay, I've told my boss and my boss says no, and I've told this person, and how far do I go? At what point do I give up? So I think it makes ethics training that much more difficult for engineers, because they are in a situation where they may not have the power to do what they would like to do in a vacuum.
Let me open it up to general questions.
That real quick?
Sure.
I did introduce myself before. I'm John Schmidt with Burns & McDonnell in Kansas City. And just touching on that issue, yeah, engineering projects tend to affect way more people than an individual one-on-one medical practice, but we never meet those people. We don't interact with the huge populations who are affected by what we do, so it becomes kind of abstract. There's people out there who are going to drive over that bridge or live or work in that building, but we don't have that personal contact that helps create an emotional connection to what we're doing from an ethical standpoint. So I think, again, that's just a difference, an aspect of engineering that's overlooked a lot of times, because for us it tends to be all about the project we work with inanimate objects most of the time, as opposed to the vast numbers of people who might be affected by it.
It's a perfect segue to my question, because I was going to ask exactly how you see, maybe for each of the panelists, to talk a little bit about how personal relationships factor into your approaches I think the middle two cases actually teaching ethics, in Erin's case to breaking down the ideologies that are so active, and in ASCE, and maybe what you do to mentor the younger members.
Anyone want to speak to either of those comments? So, please. Oh, over here. I'll go over here. I'm sorry. You've got to be quicker.
So, sorry, I was staring at the button, and then there was a pause there. So, one of the interesting things with the projects in our program range from assistive technology projects where you're intimately engaged with the end user. One of our teams is working with Amy Purdy on her prosthetics. You cannot work on that without realizing that if that thing breaks while she is on the slope, that you have just injured someone, right? And so suddenly, not only the safety, but also the personal preferences are front and center in those students' minds, right? Whereas we have projects that are mine site remediation up in the mountains. And in that case, there are a lot of stakeholders involved, but they are these nebulous stakeholders, right? And so it's a challenge, depending on the industry and the types of projects you're working on, to make those personal connections. And when you're in industry, you don't always have the freedom to say, I'm going to go further. But we have the luxury in engineering education, the safety that Carla mentioned. We refer to it as this is a safe fail. This is your last time. You're going to get the safe fail. So on a mine site remediation project, we have the license to tell the students, you have to go to their community meeting. Or maybe you have to organize their community meeting. And that's a lever that we have in engineering education that you may not get again. So I think it's our kind of duty as engineering educators to use our little bit of freedom that we have to pull that in and make those community connections that you were talking about.
And I have seen in our work too the relation to kind of moral intensity, and their relationship to how they view that. I do think it's really important, and all of these projects provide that opportunity to be involved with stakeholders, even if it's at the extent of doing user testing and really seeing how products are being used by, so that's a context that's probably, very accepted by a broader set of educators. So using those things, but I know the projects that we've talked about, it's very important that they have that engagement with the users, stakeholders on an ongoing basis. So that is really key.
Good, so I'll go over here first.
There another?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up quickly. From a sociological perspective and what we know about changing people's minds and changing cultures, getting that personal connection is fundamental. That we're engineers, sociologists, we're really interested in data, and we think in data, and we're convinced by data. But what we know about people's belief systems is they really have to be emotionally affected by something and personally affected. So they need to think deeply about how this matters to them and how this matters to people that they care about. So that's absolutely fundamental.
Okay, I will now hear.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mark Vasquez with IEEE. I wanted to bring up two things that are actually directly related. One was in response to the comment made earlier about the difference between, say, this discussion in the medical field versus the engineering field, right? Where in the engineering field, you do tend to have that other layer that you need to report to, be it a manager or a client or what have you. And then also something that was mentioned earlier, I think it might have been during Erin's talk, about, actually no, I think it was the talk about social justice versus social license and the language around that. And I think in some ways those are both related. It's a good segue for me anyway. One is that we're talking a lot about infusing a discussion of ethics in the development of engineers as designers, but I think another key aspect to that, because of the ecosystem that we work in, is engineering management, right? And introducing the ethical discussion at that level as well, so that we're also raising generations of good, solid engineering managers, not just designers and technologists. So I think that's one key thing to consider, and that actually leaps into the other comment I was going to make, which is there are some other organizations out there, especially business schools, that are looking at doing business by doing good. Focus on social good. I just completed a course last year at Case Western. They have their Weatherhead School of Business is focused specifically on training the next generation of business managers to focus on social good. And I'm curious if there are opportunities to sort of work with those other organizations that are doing work in that business space to bring in that sort of education we need at that engineering management level. And there may be opportunities there to leverage what they're doing, to bring that into the engineering space.
Great. Any response from any of our?
Yeah, that was more a statement than a question. I'm sorry, but yeah.
So let me go over here for another question.
My question, in a way, relates to Erin's. Just mentioned the technical social dualism in professional culture, but also relates with, I noticed we have some participants from the industry in the room. So I'm Denver Town from Penn State, and my colleagues and I, we do several projects on supporting faculty development in ethics teaching. And so we always started these projects by interviewing faculty about the current practices, the needs, the challenges they encounter. And during one of my recent round of interviews, one of the faculty members shared with me a very interesting idea. He is very passionate about ethics education, but he says that the technical part is non-negotiable, because if we cut any portion of the technical part, our graduates will be at a disadvantage when they compete for jobs with other engineering graduates from other engineering schools. So the assumption here is that technical preparation is the only thing that matters in getting a job, not in long-term professional success, but perhaps at the initial stage. So my question, I have actually two questions. First is, I wonder whether it's a truth or a myth that technical preparation is the only thing that gets engineers a first job. And second is, if it is a myth, then how did this myth somewhat end up in the minds of engineering faculty members? Thanks.
Panel would speak to that.
All right, so this is a tough one, but I'll put in my 2 cents in that I think that it is a myth, because so if we think of a very technical way of approaching a problem, so let's give an imaginary engineer a imaginary technical problem, and we've trained these folks to really think at a high level about technical problems. And so the first thing they do is they draw a black box, right? Because that's what a good engineer would do. And they do their inputs and outputs and boundaries, and they're starting to solve the problem. The question is does that mean that the inputs and outputs and the flows don't include people and information? That's the argument that's being made, I think, when we separate the technical and social. And it's a really false argument. Granted, now I come from a product development background, so you couldn't develop products unless you take all of those things into consideration. But I would argue that when we have a project on redesigning an intersection in our city, we send the students out there to just sit next to the intersection and watch people before that happens, right? So I do think it's false. I think it's easy. I think the reason that exists is because it is easy to say that, to simplify your problem, right? It's an easy simplification of the problem that's not a justified one. That's my personal.
Yeah, I would echo that. the process of drawing the line around what is technical and what is not is itself a cultural and social process. That is a cultural ideology that we as a profession decide what counts as technical and not. So the example I like to use of this is a lab that was designing software to be able to teach autistic children to read facial expression. And so someone would put their face up to this machine, and the machine would read the software and explain to the student what kind of expression was happening on the faces. And in this lab, it was being tutored by a low-income high school, and many of the students couldn't get the facial recognition software to work. And one of the high school students says, "It doesn't work on dark people," and it didn't, because no one in the lab had thought to have that be part of the way that the technology was designed and created. And so technology, the success of the engineering itself, requires us to understand that the dichotomy between social and technical is false. And I think those are really powerful examples to teach students to actually dissolve the dichotomy itself.
I'll just add real quickly, our experience is that students get jobs because of their broader professional and broader set of skills. And really kind of going back to the and, technical is really important, and really not making these distinctions between that. So, I feel like we've been more successful when we really say the and, that it is those broad. But I agree, kind of, there's this, too often this dichotomy or ways of thinking of not how integrated those things really are.
Okay, great. I'll go back over here.
I'm Wade Robison. I'm not an engineer, I'm a philosopher. And I was struck by the way people have been talking about ethical problems. I'm going to pick on Carla, because hers was the most obvious example, but Tara did the same thing. What Tara said was, I don't often get calls from people who talk about ethical dilemmas. Carla started off, if you look at your slides, I think it was the second or third, talking about ethical problems as ethical dilemmas. You then moved into talking about ethical issues. And part of the problem with talking about ethical dilemmas, the very phrase, two things wrong with it. One is not all problems that are ethical are dilemmas. And that focuses on individual people. So you could have two other kinds of problems at least. One sort is what I would call conceptually problematic, where it's unclear what due care constitutes, for example, in a lawyer or a doctor. Not a dilemma here. You've got some real substantive arguments about what a person ought to do in regard to something. The other, which I think is far more common than dilemmas, are factually problematic. You're faced with making a decision and you do not have enough information to be sure you're doing it right, or you may have enough, but you don't know that you have enough, and you're stuck with making a decision with unclear information. Then you have to appeal to a decision procedure, and that itself is a moral issue, which decision procedure you do. The second point I want to make is, if you talk about ethical dilemmas, you're focusing on individuals. You're not doing the kind of thing that Thompson just mentioned, focusing on the wider thing. So you need to think about how you talk about ethical issues so that you can do the kind of thing, I can't remember the name of this gentleman right in front of me. He's absolutely right, and that is you've got to have ethical thinking in design solutions. It's actually already there. When engineers solve design problems, they are making ethical choices. And the very simple way of thinking about it is the artifact that's produced is going to have effects in the world. Some are going to be good, some are going to be bad. And what you need to do when you're assessing a design solution is talk about the consequences of the introduction of that artifact into the world and ask whether there isn't a better way of doing it. So comment, not a question.
So good.
But I did want to respond. So I think I certainly agree about the dilemma kind of subject. The instrument that we were developing poses a question where they have to make a decision. And we're forcing kind of this dichotomy of, would I do this or not do this? And in that situation, I use that word to reflect that. But then what we talk about after that is that the world is not really phrased that way. And often as designers, we have the ability to not just be forced into these either or kinds of conversations. So the example we talk about, we were designing a card for children with disabilities to participate in a soapbox derby. And the question was, they were originally designing it so it basically had a false way in which they thought they were steering. And the parent had actually asked us to keep up this notion to the student that they were, the child, that they were actually driving the car. And what should we do about this? And so should we kind of have this false pretense? What it ended up happening after we kind of worked through some of those issues was that we identified that we could actually do a slip clutch mechanism where the student did have ability to control this. There was a professional driver in the car as well, but when it became unsafe, they could take over. So those are the kinds of conversations that we say. So the dilemma really is almost in that forced, where you think you have two options, but you really don't. And what can you do as an engineer or as a designer or in practice as a manager to kind of address those broader concerns? So.
Great example, thank you.
So we're coming up on the end of the period, and as someone who works primarily on issues in the food system, I'm keenly aware of the ethical importance of coffee. However, we got started a little late, and so I want to take the three questions that are in line before we go to break.
Quick question for Jered, and then a comment, which perhaps you all can respond to. So, am I correct, at least the way you presented it, these issues of social justice embedded is only in the capstone design? It does not occur earlier in the curriculum?
So no, I presented it capstone focused. The students do get other ethics training earlier in the curriculum. I'm focusing on capstone.
Okay. Well, I'll still make a comment. I mean, depending on how much they get, given Erin's work, it may not be surprising, maybe not in your case, but in some of our other institutions, that they have difficulty with ethics and social justice writ large if it's not been there early in the curriculum. And I want to point to some other exemplars. So one of the programs I run is Revolutionizing Engineering and Computer Science Departments. And just about all of the projects there have some aspect of infusing some kind of ethical or social justice issue in the program. But I want to particularly point out University of San Diego, whose project is basically about changing the engineering education, the canon of their engineering program to be engineering for social justice and humanitarian engineering, social justice, and peace. And so that's really, I think, going to what you are all talking about in terms of, and particularly I think, Erin, you said, not an add-on, not a class that you take, but something that's part of the curriculum and perhaps a way to mitigate or eliminate the technical social dualism.
Okay, so I'm Stephanie Bird. I'm co-founder, co-editor of Science and Engineering Ethics, among other things. So in one sense, I've been around long enough to see a lot of deja vu on this. And I have to say that this is like drinking from a fire hose. There was so much very rich information that you all provided, some of which was disappointing. And since we did the first course on real-world ethics, which was originally Ethical Issues in the Work Life of Scientists and Engineers with Caroline Woodbeck at MIT in 1986. And so to not see a lot of changes in attitudes, it's a little disappointing, but perhaps not surprising for a lot of reasons that you all have laid out. One of the things that I really liked seeing about the things that you talked about, some of you talked about, was the multidisciplinary discussions and the importance of bringing in context in a really effective and integrated way. And one of the things that I think is a tool that's critically important for doing that are the scenarios and the scenario discussions. And I think that one of the problems I see with a lot of scenarios are that they kind of lay out the problem in a narrative, and the narrative pretty much either blatantly or perhaps subtly conveys what it is that the author of the scenario thinks is the answer and what the problems are, and kind of directs the discussion. So I really vote for scenarios that really provide the practice of thinking through how you're going to respond to the next question or the next discussion that you're going to have, because that's how people communicate, and that's where the ethics are embedded. And so I really would vote for giving and I'm sure you do, but I love that that scenario discussions are really an important part of the classes, and bringing in a broader perspective, because I know that one of the things that really supported the discussions about ethics, engineering ethics and science and engineering at MIT was Mary Potter Rowe, the ombudsperson at MIT, who shared with us her experience of getting from alumni of MIT calls saying, "I loved my technical training at MIT, but it did not prepare me to be a professional, because all these kinds of ethical issues that are part of my professional life were not even identified or recognized as part of what my professional life was going to be about." So, so I think that to the extent that you can recruit for your individual programs alums who can talk about and provide the real world significance for the students about what they're experiencing, and bringing in faculty from across the discipline and trainees, like junior trainees, junior faculty, and postdocs to really share what they've actually encountered, as opposed to the theory that we provide them with, would be really an interesting and I think enriching way to go about it. And I know to some extent you really do that, but I would like to reinforce that as an effective way to approach these kinds of issues.
Thank you. Anyone want to follow up?
I'll just throw in, I think that's all very important. The one trick with writing these ethics scenarios that I learned the hard way, the first time that we proposed an ethics scenario a while back, I wrote it up and exactly what you said happened, and that it was clear I had a bias, and so I got a bunch of student responses that basically said, well, obviously, and obviously the right answer is, and so actually the night before I hopped on the plane to come here, we were working on the ethics scenario for this semester, and we actually had a couple faculty in the room, and we assigned each of us a course of action that we were fighting for. And so then we massaged the case text until we could justify each of our angles, so that we knew there were at least 3 well-supported ways to address this, because we had each sort of role-played and had a role of, I am fighting for, this is how you're supposed to do this. And so if you have the opportunity to get those other people in the room when you're writing these scenarios, it's super helpful to lead to better discussions.
I'll be brief. So thank you for wonderful presentations, and I'll just go to my 2 questions. One is to Carla. Wonderful program, but I was struck by the reference to a Kohlbergian approach in moral theory. Doesn't that already prejudge what is the framework and the kinds of moral skills you want your students to acquire? So I wanted to hear a justification, or what was the thinking, because that is quite striking. And then to Erin, I imagine that you kept disaggregated data on gender, and if it impacts the way in which engineers, as they go professional, their own ethical responsibilities, or So I imagine that you have some of that data, and if it corroborates certain kind of male culture that you began analyzing. So thank you.
Yes, so we are aware of the critiques, and I think we move more to the neo-Kohlbergian, which is really schema-based. And if you think about a post-conventional thinking, that the values and so that it's not, it's beyond maybe justice, caring ethics can be considered in those broader ideals and appealing to that. And so it's a framework in which to understand there are maybe more comprehensive ways to think about ethical issues and ethical decision making. So it is a limitation. We are looking to kind of continue to develop that and know that that's kind of a starting place of understanding that, and then really understanding how that framework aligns, conflicts with other ways of thinking. So we're really moving forward in evaluating that framework as part of a way to think about it. So.
In regard to the point about gender, that's a good question. I found that there was actually very little variation in the decline in these public welfare beliefs over time by gender. The only difference was that women's social consciousness values were marginally less likely than men's to decline, but the patterns were generally the same. Smith is a women's only college, obviously, and so we were interested to I was interested to see what happened at Smith. And Smith students were more likely than the other 3 schools to maintain concern for professional and ethical responsibilities, but had declines in the same space. And what I think going on there is the process of professional socialization of students in engineering education is quite powerful. And so we don't get a lot of differences in general by gender. And women, for example, who disagree with some of the things that are being taught don't necessarily push back in their classes, they leave. And so the students who stay in engineering tend to be the ones who align pretty well with the things that they're being socialized into.
So let's thank our panel one time. And do you still want people back here at 10:30? Fraser says yes. You have 20 minutes.